Maybe over the last year or so, some of you were surprised, like I was, when all of a sudden, over the radio, the song Fast Car played. Fast Car, originally from the 1980s by singer-songwriter Tracy Chapman, a cover had been made by country singer-songwriter Luke Combs. The song took hold, caught fire, became enormously popular. And so it was natural that Fast Car would get performed at the Grammys this past February. And as the telecast was happening and you heard those iconic, right, like first notes on guitar, the camera was zoomed all the way in on the hands of the person playing guitar for Fast Car, and lesbians and folkies everywhere drew in a gasp. Those were not Luke Combs' hands. Those were Tracy Chapman's hands. Tracy Chapman, a black queer woman, was playing the intro riff to her song, and as it zoomed slowly out, you saw her guitar and then all of her, and saw that she was going to share the stage with Luke Combs, who had repopularized her song. And there was a lot of thinking and writing, as there always is after something big and exciting happens at an awards show, though it's nice this time that it's something cool and interesting rather than something that makes us wonder what people are doing with their lives. About what it meant for Tracy Chapman, who, though she is certainly one of the most profound and popular singer-songwriters of our time, lives a mostly reclusive life, is not really making or recording new music very much, is mostly living her life. And then Luke Combs, who, right, for all, right, when you look at him on the surface, looks like what some of us might think of as a good old boy, a big white dude playing country music, that they shared the stage, united by the power of the song Fast Car. And it's funny, because in his cover of Fast Car, normally when an artist covers a song, they put their own spin on it, they change it up. Often, if they have a different gender than the person who originally wrote the song, they will change the lyrics to reflect that. But Luke Combs so profoundly respected the integrity and specificity of Tracy Chapman's songwriting that he left all of the original lyrics exactly intact, which is why this big country dude sang the line that he was working in the market as a checkout girl. Because that was how powerful her original song was, the specificity of her song. This very particular slice of experience that she wrote about in the song was so powerful, so moving, so captivating, exactly as it was, that Luke Combs felt no need to alter it in order to introduce it to a new audience. They were united together making music, not because either of them had watered down who they were, but because they found joy in the artistry of this beautiful, particular, specific song that reflected this beautiful, particular, specific experience. Sometimes it feels like this moment we live in is one where specificity and particularity are seen as the enemy of unity or togetherness or community or cohesion. like Reverend Christina preached about a couple weeks ago, people experience specificity as threatening. Right? The idea that someone's particular experience is unique, is theirs, is not there for you to understand or to make sense of, but it is. It's their specific and particular experience. And that all around us we see examples of politicians, of school boards, of pastors, of family members, of community members who find that specificity threatening. But what that moment on the Grammy stage and what the eternal witness of the song Fast Car shows us is that sometimes specificity is actually the foundation of unity, not the enemy of it. And that our capacity to be specific about our own experience and experience someone else's specific experience without watering it down, without changing the lyrics to make us more comfortable, that it is in those spaces that we find our ability to work and be and live and make community together. And this tension between how do we make a group that feels like a group? How do we make a thing that feels like a thing? How do we make an all? How do we make a one out of the many? That this has been a tension that the collective we have been struggling with for centuries, that we've been struggling with since the founding of our country. And that when we think about that slogan, that motto, e pluribus unum, making a one out of the many, I think I know in my heart, and I think many of you know too, we have not always gotten that right. And sometimes it's easy to cast that struggle between the specific and the whole as some sort of like newfangled identity politics problem that, I don't know, was like invented in the early 2000s. But that's not true. We've been struggling with it for a long time, pretty much as long as human beings have been making community. They've been trying to figure out what to do with the fact that human beings are unique, each of us. And I think that Walt Whitman's poetry lives in that space of tension between the specific and the particular and the universal and the vast. Lives in tension between the fact that, I am made of the atoms from the Big Bang, and so are you, and so is that chair, and so is that piano, and so is that robin. And like, wow, the vast oneness of everything. The tension between that mystical wonder and the reality that we as human beings struggle with one another, we do hard things to one another. But that Walt Whitman is not always seen, especially by powers that be, or by sort of who I think of as the literary authorities, sort of the Statler and Waldorf Muppets of English literature. That's who I picture making poetry anthologies and things like that for our, right? And they always include Whitman, certainly, and his poetry gets taught to lots of us in high school or college. But not always with the lens that acknowledges how deeply subversive his messages are about both the relationship between us and our bodies and the bodies of others, and about what I think of as his mystical humanism. right? His deep sense that you would do better to contemplate the vastness of the universe than to argue with other people about whether or not there's a God. And that sometimes Whitman can also be sort of watered down as just sort of like milquetoast Americana. And that, thank goodness for other poets like June Jordan, who wrote a spectacular essay and then edited actually a book of spectacular essays about Walt Whitman in relationship to writers of color in the United States. And June Jordan, in her essay, writes this about Walt Whitman and his poetry. She says, "This great American poet of democracy as cosmos, this poet of a continent as consciousness, this poet of the many people as one people, this poet of diction comprehensible to all, of a vision insisting on each, of a rhythm, a rhetorical momentum to transport the reader from the Brooklyn Ferry into the hills of Alabama and back again, of line after line of bodily concrete detail that constitutes the mysterious, the cellular tissue of a nation indivisible but dependent on and astonishing in its diversity, this white father of a great poetry deprived of its spontaneous popularity, a great poetry hidden away from the ordinary people it celebrates so well. He has been again and again cast aside as an undisciplined poser, a merely freak eruption of prolix perversities." Which is a fancy way of saying, right, he was denied popularity in his own era, in part due to some of the sensual content in Song of Myself and in Leaves of Grass, and in part because he wrote so much, right? That phrase prolix perversities is like my new favorite way of just saying like lots of wordy stuff that's maybe like a little dirty. I love June Jordan. That Walt Whitman held in his poetry a vision insisting on each. And that made me think about that piece, the cellular tissue of a nation, indivisible, but dependent upon and astonishing in its diversity. And in so many places, we hear the word diversity and its contemporary cousins, equity and inclusion, cast aside as like liberal agenda. I think I've actually heard people say, like, I don't believe in DEI. And we talk a lot, actually, about diversity as Unitarian Universalists. It's in the little front piece that we talk about. We talk about how important diversity is to us. But the word that matters most to me is actually not diversity. Right? Because caring about diversity is like caring about gravity. It's caring about something that just is. Diversity just is. Look around the room, and you might say, there's not, right, the sort of like what diversity is code word for, which is people of color, in great number. But human beings are enormously diverse, person to person. Our lives, our experiences, our bodies, our hair, our hands, our feet. If we went outside and examined the grass or the flowers or the trees, none of them are the same. Diversity is a fact of existence in our world. And if you don't believe in it, I think you're kind of a flat earther, to be honest. So maybe what people are saying when they say they don't believe in diversity is that they don't believe in pluralism. Because diversity is a fact of our existence. But pluralism is a political position. It's a theological position. about how we want to make a spiritual community together. It's saying not only does diversity exist, but we believe that a community is strongest when there is a multiplicity of identities and viewpoints held within it. It's why it's that e pluribus unum, but in the sense of our spiritual and theological journeys together. And so in order to engage pluralism, this big, broad idea that means that not only do we acknowledge the truth, the reality that human beings are diverse, but we say we want to make a community that expects that diversity, that expects multiplicity, and does not ask you to change the lyrics to make someone else more comfortable. That in order to do that, we have to engage with the specificity of each and every person's life. And this is, I'm just going to read some little snatches of Whitman, because I think they are important, right? And when we were putting together all of the worship themes for this year, when Reverend Christina and I were putting together all the worship themes, we sort of lifted the phrase, we contain multitudes, to talk about pluralism, and then I said, I have to talk about Walt Whitman, Christina. Because it would be disingenuous to say, to sort of lift the phrase without really engaging with what he meant when he said it. Because the opening line of Song of Myself is this. He says, I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume for every atom belonging to me, as good as belongs to you. Right? It's just this deep sense that I exist in relationship to you, and that you exist in relationship to me, and we're all existing in relationship to each other, not in a transactional way, but in a mystical way. And that is a foundation of humanism and transcendentalism, too, of the idea that our primary purpose in life is not to be units of economic production or units of salvation in the Lord, but instead to exist and to connect with people and place and nature and sky. And that, right, for the mid-1800s and today, was radical and subversive stuff. That you and I don't exist so that we can exchange goods and build capital and then pass it on to the next generation. You and I don't exist so that we can, point out each other's sins until we all are judged on the final judgment day. You and I exist because we exist. And that every atom in my being, I only possess it as much as you possess it, because none of us actually possess anything because we're part of this mystical oneness. This poet of democracy as cosmos. And so pluralism Sometimes we think about it just in the sense that pluralism is about how we figure out how the heck we get along when we don't all think the same way. Which, right, like how many of us have struggled to make community with people with whom we do not agree? Right now, this very day, in these walls, we struggle to make community with people with whom we do not agree. And sometimes we it's this weird tension in Unitarian Universalist community because we have said one of our values is pluralism. We have many journeys. We don't all have to, there's no creed, there's no dogma. But how many of you have also uttered the phrase, and I know myself among them, or thought the phrase, I'm here because I like being with like-minded people. I like being here with like-minded people who I disagree with. Right? So pluralism is not just about how we navigate interpersonal relationships or how we hold space, right, that between you and me we can have different ideas and still be friends. Though that is part of navigating a pluralistic society. But pluralism in the context of a spiritual community is about how we construct what it means to be a one, a community, a togetherness. And this is where it's important to elevate and to consider what I think of as Walt Whitman's queerness. And I don't say this because I want to categorize his life or his romances into our modern categories of gay, straight, bi, or queer, right? That Walt Whitman's sexuality existed, right? He lived most of his life before the word homosexual was ever put together. Right? That the word homosexual didn't come until the second half of the 1800s. And so Walt Whitman lived most of his life, and particularly his young adult life, before that word even existed. But to be clear, Walt Whitman would also not have fit in our modern category of straight. And so, but I use the word queer to describe Walt Whitman particularly because he insisted that we are called to live embodied lives and write embodied poetry and do embodied community. Right? His poetry, which speaks about the wholeness of his being, which includes thinking about his body and thinking about the bodies of others, not just in terms of sexual relationships, though it does include that. That is why Walt Whitman was once fired from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because his boss found a copy of his poetry in his desk and was scandalized by what he read in it. But then he got a better job at the Office of the Attorney General. Right? But that he insisted on living this embodied life. And so when we think about what it means to make pluralistic religious community, I think sometimes we think of it as meaning that we're just making room for debate. Right? That building pluralistic community means that we're just willing to debate each other about our different ideas. But it's not that, though there will be if you want to debate somebody, you will find someone in this room who would debate you gladly. But it's about our willingness to live an embodied life and invite that from others. And that Walt Whitman was, in many ways, the seminal poet in the United States who invited that. Right? A century before Mary Oliver would invite us, more than a century, right? Before Mary Oliver would invite us to let the soft animal of our body love what it loves. Walt Whitman was like, you have a body. It is how you interact with the world. Other people have bodies too. That's how they interact with the world. Your community is made up of people who have bodies that are made of the cosmos. It's an invitation to feel our way, not with our minds or our hearts, but with our bodies, into these two truths that I am the expression of the infinite cosmos. And so is everyone else. Sometimes that's frustrating, and sometimes it's beautiful. And that is what brings the one from the many. May it be so.